have a portion today that is a bit difficult to teach because people know a lot about it. So what I thought we would do is something a little bit different that I'm hoping won't be able to have lots of discussion. So hopefully you all will be willing to. I brought a commentary to help me through if we need it. If you don't talk enough, I'll just start reading Dennis Prager's thoughts. Just kidding.
I could dance.
Sounds great, as long as it gets caught on the video. Lori said no. All right. Well, okay, so this portion is called Toldot. Anybody know what Toldot means?
Generations.
Generations, very good. So generations. So this is another of course, we've been working our way through the patriarchs and the Abrahamic covenant, and we're going to continue. This story continues pushing that covenant forward, and we've been talking about, just as like a little bit of a recap. We talked about with the Abrahamic covenant that it is this foundational, unconditional covenant that everything else, that is kind of really the foundation, to use the same word twice, that kind of everything else builds on. So we've been kind of working our way through with this mindset and remembering that we have the three parts to the covenant. We have land, blessing, and seed, which again we see come into play as the covenant is pushed forward another generation in this portion. So before we jump into the text itself, somebody tell me just like your, couple sentence summary of what happens in this portion, of what this story of Jacob and Esau is. What's the point of it? What are things that, or what, even just what is your like initial, when you think of this, story of Jacob and Esau, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Or something that has stuck out to you in the teaching or something like that? Just initial thoughts.
Jacob stealing Esau's birthright.
Okay.
The continuation of the promise.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it all worked out how the Lord said it was
It all
going to
worked
work
out.
out.
There you go.
Even though
That's
man tried to help it, it was how God planned it when he told Rachel, this is how it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
So
Rebecca.
basically, he got away with pulling a fast one.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yes and no.
Yeah.
So how would it have happened if he didn't steal it? Interesting
That's a
question.
good question.
Mhm.
Yes.
This is an interesting question.
I think
Any other? Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, this story really reminds me how much Elohim Adonai is all-encompassing, and time is all one to him. There's past, present, and future in our eyes because we live in the present. We know the past. We don't know the future. But his perspective is the complete. There is no time in his. Time is something that I think was invented for us. C.S. Lewis has a whole great chapter on that in his book. But the idea that since he knows everything and he sees everything all at once, it makes sense that this story came out the way it did. So it's like, yeah, the plan from the beginning, but he knew the middle and he knew what the ending. So it's when does he plan all this stuff and how does he plan it? And that's the big question. But I think nothing was a surprise, but it was all part of the entire picture that was established from before the foundation of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think of.
I also find that I've often wondered, like, with what Rebecca was told, did she tell Isaac,
Mm-hmm.
and Isaac was not on board with it, so mom was gonna make it happen because, I mean, it was told at the very beginning, so as husband and wife, you would think they would discuss this.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like Isaac wasn't gonna get on board with this, so this
Right.
was their way to make him get on board with it, you know?
I often wonder that as well. I'm always like, did they not talk about this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like God speaks to her and they don't talk about it, like really? Like, I always wonder that too. Okay, any other initial thoughts, any reactions about this?
Yeah, because what is it about the Lord that even though it's supposed to be the firstborn with the birthright, that
Mhm.
he basically countered what
Right.
the law was, or what the way things were supposed to be set up. So it's like he's already giving grace and mercy for rearranging his own rules at
Right.
the beginning.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing too, because it's
Yeah.
definitely a pattern that continues, right? Like there's
Right.
we have lots of instances of a younger being given
Yeah.
the firstborn role.
Right.
In all of these, actually,
Mhm.
and it's not, for the most part, it's never really the firstborn that
Yeah.
gets it, it's who the Lord appoints
Mhm.
and decides gonna get
Yeah.
the blessing, cause if you look at it, you know, whether it had to do with Isaac and Ishmael, whether it had to do
Right.
with Esau and Jacob, then we're
Yeah.
looking at Judah versus Reuben versus, I mean, it
And
keeps
Joseph
going-
and.
Yeah, Joseph,
Mhm.
yeah,
And even King David.
yes.
Yeah.
King David was not the oldest, so.
So it's who the Lord appoints.
Mhm.
He's not gonna be put in a box being told, I have to do it through this.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. And there's some things that we'll see as we go through this that play into that particular question more about maybe give us some hints of why the Lord does that, other than he's God and he can do what he wants. Yes.
Yeah.
There might be another aspect that it's a principle that he established in general, and the entire earth was not only inhabited by the descendants of Abraham, you had cultures and people all over the place. So by setting up a general principle of the firstborn is the one that's responsible and gets the birthright, it makes sense because that one is the oldest and has been around the longest and knows all the rest of the siblings who come. So it makes sense in a general sense.
Sure.
So his plan isn't just Israel, but he's got the whole nations
Mhm.
involved in it. We just get to see the microcosm and under the microscope, or the, whatever you call the magnifying glass with Israel.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
possible.
With that line of thinking, are we bringing post-Exodus Sinai, Israel's firstborn, into the time of the fathers, the church fathers, like Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph? Jacob? Was there a firstborn thing that we're talking about then, like the birthright goes to, or was that something established post?
Good question.
Because
Sorry, because what?
I just wonder how we get into that line of thinking with how come God is changing his mind or changing his principles.
Yeah, so it seems like, and this would play in a little bit to what you think about when and by whom the Torah was written, which we're not gonna chase that rabbit
All right.
all the way down the trail because we'll never come back. But, but it does seem by these stories, these Genesis stories, that there is kind of an established understanding of firstborn and what that means. Because of some of the discussion, and we'll talk some about that as we start to actually go through the text. Because of even some of the language that's used and how that seems to be important. So the only way that it would make that it could be that that's being read back on is if we have a much later dating for the writing of it. I don't know, which is possible, but I don't know that that's something because again, the Torah is, I think that so let me backtrack. Okay, so but even like with the understanding that Moses wrote Genesis, these were stories that were passed down to him because obviously Moses is not yet born, but it still is like if if something were changed later, he would have probably written this differently. So this is an instance where it's like it doesn't actually make the Jewish people or Israel look very powerful to be countercultural. And so the fact that we have record of them doing a lot of things that were different than these other cultures is more support that it's authentic. And so I think by reading, if we read the text as it is, I think we can see that there's a firstborn principle already in play here. I think that it still carries on even after Exodus and through Leviticus, like we see that firstborn principle there, but there's always, because and we'll get into this more later, so we're jumping ahead a little bit, but because especially in the line of Israel, and particularly in this patriarchal line, faithfulness to God and faithfulness to the covenant kind of trumps birth order, which is ultimately what the issue comes down to. And as we look at some of these nuances and some of the things that are going on in this story, we'll kind of see that, because yes, God said that and to Rebecca, but there's some things about Esau in the text that are like he cannot be the one in the line because of this faithfulness issue. So it's kind of a both and again, it's this relational quality that to God, right? It's this relational. It's this like, it's not. This is the order. This is how you do it. Follow the instructions. Check off your list. Bullet points. It's like, this is the guideline. However, this is important, and you need to be talking to me about this and all of these kinds of things.
So can I bring Yeshua in real quick? I'm thinking of it's the heart of the law versus the letter of the law. And wouldn't Yeshua technically be the second Adam? I don't know if that's actually said in Scripture, but I'm thinking when he said, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, that he's purposely breaking laws and commandments of men versus, the heart of the Father is, save someone on the Sabbath, all the different things that he does to break the rules, but they're man's rules, not God's rules.
Right.
So maybe this is a man's rule and not actually God's, since it's not explicitly said, or that's just theory.
I don't think. I think there's just more. I think it's just not as straightforward as we want it to be. It's just not like, it's not that it's not that the firstborn being the one to get the birthright is counter to what God's plan would, except for in these situations. So it's kind of a both and, because even with Yeshua, he's really not telling, the Pharisees and the Torah scholars not to do what they're doing.
That's true.
He's addressing their heart behind it.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're correct in that he is concerned about their heart. That is the most important thing. But I think that's the principle we have here too. It's like, you don't give it to the firstborn just because you're supposed to give it to the firstborn. It matters who they are and how they're faithful,
right.
And all these kinds of things. And so there again, it's kind of that both end and kind of principle, and it goes back to being about relationship and going back to obedience to God and your heart towards the Lord. Yeah.
So would it have to do with those who choose to follow God then, their hearts in righteousness? Like we see that line from Abraham down to Noah, and then Adam down to Noah, then Abraham afterwards. So being that Esau was a man of the field versus Jacob who resided in tents, was it his heart posture? We don't know, but he chose righteousness and God's ways versus the other. So that one I would imagine had a tremendous reflection on who was going to continue that promised line.
Right. Yeah.
Well, even if we were to look in a practical sense in the here and now, a man builds a generational family business. And he's getting ready to die, and let's say he has 2 sons, and the oldest son is a drunkard who wastes money, and the younger son is somebody who has worked hard and wants to keep the family business. Who inherits the family business then?
Right.
The one that's going to continue on with what the father built.
Exactly. And yet the older son is probably not going to be very happy about it.
No. Probably sue the younger brother.
And so it's this sibling dynamic, and Dennis Prager talks a lot about this, is like, it seems like there's a lot of sibling tension. Yeah. Even like these families in Genesis are messy.
Yeah.
Again, looking back, it's like and this is again, this contrast of Adonai, God of Israel, versus other gods, is that the myths of other gods, everybody's perfect. Like everybody's, kind of like put on a pedestal and whatever. And yes, they fight, and there's also, it's messy there too, but in a very different way. Whereas in Genesis, these families, they're very real. Like we can identify with these sibling rivalries and these just messy families who, even the interactions of Rebecca and Isaac with, how different they are with their 2 sons, it's like, we can relate to that. We either experienced some of these dynamics in our own families, or we've seen how that's played out in other families. Like, they're real families. They're not, just because they're God's chosen people doesn't mean they're like perfect and that they have like protection from these difficult dynamics, which kind of can say to us that God is looking to work through those things and use those things, and again, going back to relationship versus just, you know, getting rid of it or working outside of that, or, you know, being that distant. He's still very present in the midst of it. Okay, so let's actually work on getting to the text itself. So one more question before we actually jump in and start taking some of this apart. Okay, so, because I want us to think about this as we go through. So we have four, we've mentioned all of them in our discussion so far. We have four like main characters. Who are they in this story?
Isaac, Rebecca, Jacob, Esau.
Yep, exactly. So Isaac, Rebecca, Jacob, Esau. So pay attention to, well, and let's do this briefly. We're gonna start moving, I promise. We're gonna actually read the text, I promise. So, and we've kind of mentioned some things. So Isaac, what do you think about Isaac in this story? Just like your first thoughts about how he interacts, or what you think of him from what we know about him from the text.
Old.
He's old.
Hopefully not senile, but kind
But
of
maybe.
wonder.
Uh-huh.
Almost timid.
Okay.
Definitely not assertive.
Yeah, his
Mhm.
discernment's off.
Or his follow through for what he discerns, which he says, this doesn't really seem like it's, you know, when he's doing the airy,
Mm-hmm.
and the arm is like, okay, why is he not figuring out this isn't real hair?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Anything else about Isaac popping in mind?
Well, it almost carries over from the last Torah portion where sometimes it just doesn't seem like he's overly involved. You know, like
Mm-hmm.
he was 40 before he had a wife, and his dad had to go get one. You know, we
Right.
kind of discussed
Mhm.
this, and now it's 20 years later before they have kids now, which is, but it just seems like he doesn't seem very. Sometimes he just doesn't seem very involved. He seems like a side character
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to a lot of this.
He does. Richie?
The fear of the Lord that was upon him was great. Like, I think he really held, just based on the way he reacted when he found out that Esau was, like, he was shaking.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so I think that he held it in very high regard, and I think that's where that fear of the Lord, like, I don't want to mess this up. Maybe I saw what happened a little bit between my brother Ishmael and Hagar and Sarah and everything, and then actually being almost sacrificed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are a lot of psychological factors involved.
This is true. This
Right?
is true.
And then they sent my brother away, who I love dearly.
Right.
So there's a lot of, I don't want to mess this up. So let's just
Yeah.
God work it out kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Laura?
So I was thinking there used to be some teachings about like four main personality types, phlegmatic, and I can't remember them all now, but the phlegmatic one, which my husband is very much that way, very laid back,
Mm-hmm.
but very deep thinker, very loyal, but very laid back, and it takes a lot to get him riled, and I kind of picture Isaac as that.
Mm-hmm.
And Rebecca is like that choleric, go get it, do
Yeah.
it, outgoing, kind of personality.
Yeah.
But respectful.
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of honoring, but yet behind the scenes, she's probably a fireball.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, and I think we talked about this a little bit last week with Isaac too. It seems that, and I think this plays into some things that you guys are touching on, is that I think he was alone a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he was probably, because he was alone quite a bit, I think this is kind of my thought process about it, that he maybe was very much an internal processor, so he wasn't as, he wasn't as demonstrative in how he did things because he was alone a lot. He wasn't, like we were talking about, his brother was sent away, we don't have a lot of, he was kind of by himself even when Rebecca came. It seems that, he really loved her. He was probably very happy to be with her, but he was kind of, he had this very different, and he definitely has a different kind of affect than either Abraham or Jacob even. So Isaac is an interesting character. Okay, let's move on. Rebecca, what do you think of when you think about Rebecca?
Like Laura said, she played her role in front of everybody, but I
Mhm.
kind of see her wearing pants behind the scenes.
Okay.
Intuitive and discerning.
Okay.
Mhm.
because of the way she was feeling when she was pregnant, and she went and inquired of Abba, Adonai.
Uh-huh.
Passionate.
Mm-hmm.
But also caring and serving because, yeah.
Well, that's even, that's our introduction to Rebecca, right?
Right,
Is that
right.
she's serving the stranger.
Right.
And that was a big deal. Okay.
But she was determined that what the
Mhm.
Lord told her
Mhm.
was gonna come to pass. And I also find even with her, when when Abraham was very determined, his son was not gonna marry of the Canaanites.
Mm-hmm.
And the same way here, we see Rebecca is very determined that her son is not gonna marry from
Right.
this group.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I also kind of wonder if she's a bit of a pageant mama.
Pageant.
Who's that?
The moms who put their little teeny tiny girls in the pageants, and this is what you're going to do, this is how you're going to look. You're by not necessarily vicariously living through her children,
Mm.
but
But very
I have
focused
a-
on achievement of children.
Yes.
Mhm.
yes.
Sure.
When, Rich, is that your name?
Yes.
When Rich was talking about the traumas that Isaac experienced, remember was the one who was put on the altar to be sacrificed.
Right.
I mean, that's
That's an experience that would stay with you, I would imagine.
Especially if he
Yeah.
heard the angel,
Yeah.
right?
yeah.
So he's living real time supernatural stuff
Right.
that's
And
manifesting.
especially at the age that he would have been, because most have believed that he was around 13.
Yeah.
So at that age, like that formative type of age, I imagine that's an experience that would shape your life.
You bet.
And with him being a little bit seeming to be a little standoffish from his kids and picking his favorite because he was so old and everything, is that also because of the trauma of sacrifice?
Mhm.
And he didn't want maybe not to get that attached to the kids in case something like that was asked of him.
Possible.
He loved Esau though,
Yeah.
and Abraham loved Ishmael.
Yeah.
So I think that so much time passes in between the next verse and everything that it kind of appears like that on the surface without
Yeah.
having a lot of that
Mhm.
background.
But
I
you
mean,
can
but I
love
think
on
it-
them.
Mhm.
You can love on them so much and still keep your distance.
Yeah, because I think it's possible, because I mean, he might have been thinking, well, God told Abraham he had to do this, so what's he going to tell me about my kids? So I think that there might be some tension, some push and pull with that.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible. We don't know. Okay, so Jacob, what do you think about when you think of Jacob?
Supplanter,
Mama's boy.
conniver.
Yeah.
Insider information.
Okay.
But he was obedient.
Yes.
Okay.
What do they mean when they said that he's mild? At least that's what New King James says. That means he's passive aggressive. He's non-confrontational. I don't know.
Yeah. It's possible. It's one of those words that's hard because we don't use that term to describe
Right.
people, so it's a little bit
Mm-hmm.
hard to know exactly what it means.
Well, what other term was used for it other than in King James? What did some of the other versions?
I'm looking up commentary.
Yeah, I don't know. Actually, yeah, TLV says he was a mild man, remaining intense. So it seems to be,
What verse is that?
25, 27.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what Gregor says, how he translated it. No, he says mild man too, or his translation, so apparently we still use that. But I mean, it seems to be in the contrast of like,
Quiet.
Esau goes out and hunts and, gets all this wild game, that he kind of stays close to home. So it seems to mean that he's a little bit more,
It says that
Yeah.
he's quiet in this translation, but there's also
Yeah.
complete, pious, gentle, or dear.
okay. Well, and he stays close to his mom, so we have this, he's in the kitchen cooking stew, so whereas Esau's kind of out being the man's man, it's how it seems to be
Yeah.
portrayed.
Blue collar versus white collar?
Maybe. Mm-hmm.
The word Tom there is blameless man, complete, guiltless, integrity, peaceful, perfect one.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, so Esau, what do you think about when you think of Esau?
A bit thick.
He seems to be driven by his passions and his fleshly passions. Hunger, desire, I want it now, but it doesn't describe him looking or pursuing anything of the desires of the Lord. It's like, I want this woman and I'll marry her, I want that, And there's obviously a little bit of jealousy that he deals with too, because when he sees that his parents preferred who his brother married over his wives, he's still impulsive on how he does it. You don't see him petitioning the Lord in anything that he's doing. He's kind of just reactionary.
Yeah.
It seems like maybe a blatant disregard for the ways of God. Isn't he the one that married the sons of Het, which were constant irritations to the family? So if he has a disregard for propriety and for the ways that the Lord is trying to lead the family, that's a significant thing. I've read some things about birth order, and one of the things that came out in what I understood was that the firstborn has the greatest propensity for either accepting authority or rejecting authority. And that the secondborn is more like the one that goes out and conquers the world. They're free because they don't have the weight and the responsibility of taking and overseeing the family. They're freer to go do things. So like I think a lot of your astronauts were secondborn and things like that. Now it doesn't fit everything, but
Sure.
at least
But,
in some of my observations, that seems to be pretty true, that firstborn has the greatest propensity for accepting authority and submitting to authority and taking responsibility in that way, or rejecting and completely going off the rails. It doesn't mean that others don't, but
Sure.
it seems to be
Yeah.
that way. So
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay. So let's start working through some of this portion and see if we find out any other things about these characters and the story as a whole. Because basically, how we're framing this is it's very much how we usually talk about it. And I'm not saying it's wrong. I think it's very much correct. I just think that there's some nuance that we can maybe discover. But is that that Jacob's because we were using the frame Jacob's stealing the birthright, that he's he has this inside information that he's kind of and he's this mama's boy, and then Rebecca, Rebecca is really kind of this fiery personality who's gonna make sure that this happens the way it's supposed to, that Esau goes against the Lord, that Isaac's kind of uninterested a lot of the time. I think those are all actually very, very accurate to the story. But I think this is actually a very complicated story. And so I kind of just want us to kind of revisit it and just and see some of that complication and let it be complicated.
Let it be.
Because, and even some of I kind of want us to look at, is this really true? Is this understanding that Jacob stole the birthright but it worked out, is that really true, and is that the best way to say it? I have described this story that way many times, so I'm not trying to criticize. I'm just saying, is there a piece to this that can shift how we describe it and how we look at it that maybe is a little bit more honest to what is trying to be communicated?
Esau disdained it, actually,
Yes.
by his actions and what he was doing. So
you're implying, or you're asking, did he actually steal it?
Yes.
Well, no,
That's
he
one
said
of the questions.
Sell it. He had
That's a
to
good question.
sell it to him.
He did. And part of it is even so we're gonna look at this section first with the birthright and the bowl of stew, but then later, even with this whole thing with Rebecca setting him in, pretending to be Esau, we often just put the, stamp the deceit stamp on the whole story. And yes, there is deception. I'm not trying to argue with you that there's not. I'm just trying to say, is there more to it? Or is this, they decided to do this and God was kind to work it out anyway, or were they still kind of under the umbrella of the will of God? That's the kind of the question I'm posing. And there may be multiple answers to the question, but that's the question that I'm kind of setting out before us a little bit. Okay, so let's look at Genesis 25. So I'm going to kind of summarize and read some sections, because if we read all of it, we'll be here all day, and we can't be here all day. Okay, so Isaac's 40 years old. When they get married, 20 years before she's barren. We have again where Adonai is opening her womb. So we again have this, like, Adonai is the one who is making this happen. The children are struggling, so yes, Rebecca inquires of him, and he says to her, this is verse 23, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 peoples from your body will be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other people, but the older will serve the younger. So, yes.
Why another 2 nation?
Right.
I mean,
Exactly.
we've already got this.
Right. I'm like, it's like this is already complicated enough. We already have this issue of
2 nations, yeah.
Ishmael and Isaac.
And I'm thinking of where the Lord says he uses the weak things of the world to confound the wise. And there's another verse I've been getting a lot lately, is not many wise, not many noble, not many mighty are called. And so God likes to use the lesser or the weaker, because his strength is made perfect in weakness.
That's good. No, that's good. I think that's good. I think that ties in well. And so of course we learn that there are twins. Esau is born first, and he is born holding on to, or Jacob is born holding on to Esau's heel, which is very interesting. And he was named Jacob. So, okay, so let's pause for just a second. So we have God speaking directly to Rebecca, which is significant, and giving this prophecy. So we know that she knows this. We've already talked about that. It seems strange to us that she wouldn't have had a conversation about this with Isaac, and maybe they did and he wasn't on board. We don't know. We don't know what dynamic was happening here. But we know, so verse 27, the boys grew up. Esau became a man knowledgeable in hunting and outdoorsman, while Jacob was a mild man remaining in tents. Now Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for wild game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Okay, so we have the story set up, and we've talked about this really well, so we're not gonna spend a lot of time here. We've set this up. Isaac loves Esau. He's this hunter, outdoorsman, all these things, and apparently Isaac really likes that. So, and then Jacob is, kind of intense with his mother, more mild. So they have very different temperaments, clearly, and they're favored by each parent. Yep.
Can I ask at this point, or we can discuss it later, what's the difference between birthright and blessing?
We'll get there.
Okay.
Yes, we'll talk about that. Don't worry.
All right.
Okay. So we have kind of the family dynamic set up here. So now we're going to go into, verse 29. So now Jacob cooked a stew. When Esau came in the field, he was exhausted. So Esau said to Jacob, "Please feed me some of this really red stuff, because I'm exhausted." That is why he's called Edom. Great. So Jacob said, "Sell your birthright to me today." Esau said, "Look, I am about to die. Of whatever use is this to me, a birthright?" Jacob said, "Make a pledge to me now." So he made a pledge to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank, and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. Okay. So why does Jacob want to buy the birthright?
The blessing.
The blessings. But what would put that in his mind?
For his mother.
His mother. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
All Rebecca knew was that the younger would serve the older type thing.
The older would serve the younger.
The older would serve the younger. And is it possible that she interpreted that as the chosen to that line, and which moved Jacob in this direction? And it was an opportunist moment, I feel like, to take advantage somebody in their weakness, in their ultimate weakness, like in their most reactive hypoglycemic moment. Seriously.
Yes, yeah.
And this whole thing started from the flesh because
It's
Isaac.
such an accurate way to say it. Sorry.
So intelligent.
Because Isaac related to him in the flesh with, I love these savory things.
Okay.
And you see the way Esau responds in the flesh. What does that matter to me? I'm going to die. Give it to me to eat now. Oh, you're really, this is what's going on? Give me your birthright.
Yeah. So I'm just going to pull out from what you said there. So Esau seems to be really concerned with the here and now. And Jacob is thinking a little bit more into the future, right? So we have different focus for each brother. I like that. It's good.
I think the mother, I don't think, obviously, I kind of like the pageant mom analogy, but I don't think she had that great of an influence on it. I mean, when you think, when they're born, I mean, these are newborn babies just coming out, and he has, in this underdeveloped brain, the desire, the will, and the physical strength to actually hang on to his brother's heel while they're coming out. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, for sure. So I think you're right. I think there's lots of things at play. I think his mother probably had some influence because it sounds like he was real close. So what then the question in the line of questioning of did Isaac and Rebekah not talk about this word from the Lord is like, did Rebekah tell Jacob about it? Interesting.
Probably.
Surely she has.
Which is very strange to me.
Yeah.
And again, we don't know that she didn't tell Isaac, and we don't know that she did tell Jacob, but it's kind of seeming like that's what's going on here.
It doesn't say, and she pondered these things in her heart.
Right.
This
No,
is
yeah,
true.
exactly.
Right. This is true. So yeah, she doesn't have quite that Miriam quality.
She was a verbal processor.
Yeah.
most likely.
Yes.
So she probably went on and on and on.
Yeah,
Where
she's-
Jacob knew it was 3.
Yeah.
She talked
We
about
don't.
it all the
Yeah,
time.
Isaac doesn't seem to be saying a lot, but we don't seem to have that problem with Rebekah. She seems to have a lot of words. That's really funny. Anyway, yeah. So okay. So here's the next question. So is this a legitimate transaction going on here?
If he sold it.
Sure it is.
So is Jacob being deceptive here?
No.
He's definitely being an opponist.
Yes,
Yes.
but that is not necessarily deceptive.
No.
You're
No,
correct.
He's
He
a
is
great
certainly being an
negotiator.
opportunist. Yes.
This is the time when to hit your opponent the hardest is
Yeah.
when they're at their weakest.
Clearly, he knows his brother. He knows his, because I'm guessing this is not his first experience with Esau being very dramatic about something.
True.
He was
And
passionate.
Huh?
He was passionate.
He's very passionate. And so I think we can understand, he probably knows his brother, and he probably knows that in this moment. So maybe, so he's an opportunist, he's reading the situation, but that doesn't mean that he's being deceptive. So at this point, Esau's agreeing. We have this, like, he's like, what use is this to me? But then, of course, he despises it because he doesn't have, so it's this, it's creating some tension. But this does seem to be a legitimate transaction. So everything's kind of in the clear right now. Okay, so then, and here, we're not going to spend a lot of time on chapter 26. This is kind of a different, this is confirming the covenant. This is, so highlights of this chapter, because I want us to get back to the Jacob and Esau dynamic. So God does confirm the covenant with the land and the blessing to Isaac, because there's a famine, and Isaac is about to do what Abraham did, right? And go down to Egypt, and God's like, nope, you're staying right here. And we mentioned before that Isaac is the only one of the patriarchs who never leaves the promised land.
Right.
He spends his whole life there, which is, again, Isaac's real interesting. Because he shares some similarities with the other patriarchs, and yet he's quite different. but he's obedient, he stays, which is a good thing. We have a kind of repeat scenario about calling Rebecca his sister with Abimelech, which this is likely a different Abimelech than, this is probably the next generation of Abimelech than the one that was with Abraham. It's probably, many people think it's his son, but enough time has passed, it's probably not the same Abimelech that we saw before. But his response probably is because he knows what did happen before, because he offers protection. That's what's behind this whole calling him his sister, is that it was common for, foreigners to come in, and if they liked your wife, they'd kill you and take your wife. So he's trying to prevent that from happening. But then Abimelech is offering some protection, saying no one's going to touch you or your wife, so they're protected. And it's very likely that he knew this previous situation, and that he also saw how God was with these people. In verse 26, in chapter 26, verse 12, we have this line that says, Isaac sowed in that land and was reaped 100-fold. So Isaac is a farmer, whereas the others were shepherds more so. I mean, he also had flocks and things like that, but he's the only one that we really see kind of really planting and reaping that way. So he's a little bit different in that regard as well. But again, he's also still accumulating wealth and servants in other ways. We have this whole story about the wells, which is interesting, but again, we're just doing the highlight reel on this chapter because I want us to get back to the rest of it. And then he basically makes a covenant with Abimelech so that they can live in the land, kind of coexist a little bit. So the significant part for what we're talking about right now is at the very end of chapter 26, in verse 34, when Esau was 40 years old. So interesting parallel there, that he's being married at 40 years old, just as Isaac was married at 40 years old. But comparison stops there. So when he was 40 years old, he took as a wife Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, but they caused a bitterness of spirit for Isaac and Rebekah. So he is marrying Hittite women, which is not good news. So that is a clue into, again, like we talked about, some of the characteristics of Esau. He doesn't seem to be concerned with what he's supposed to do. Again, very in the moment. He probably saw these women and was attracted to them and was like, you're the one that I want. For these two different women.
You.
I pick you and you. Forget that I'm not supposed to. That's what feels good to me right now.
So we don't know if his parents said, don't do that. We know it caused them bitterness.
Yeah.
But it seems like marital practices, normally there's some kind of input from parents on that. And
yeah.
So it makes me wonder, like, okay, so he took these two wives. Was there at any point where his parents were saying, don't do that?
So, go ahead.
I think you'd have to go to the end of the story and see what his response was with regard to his dad sending Jacob away to go get a wife. Because it's then that he says he realized, he understood. Like, I don't think he understood the gravity of it then, but afterwards, in the totality of everything that happened, he might have been a little dense.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know?
and then he still went to Ishmael's family
Keeping
to
it
get
in
a
the
wife
fam-
too, so he still wasn't.
No, but Ishmael is not a bad thing. He's keeping it in the family. He's doing the next best thing,
The
right?
next best
Not marrying the foreigner. There's no bad things about Ishmael except that Sarah knew who was getting that birthright.
Right.
Ishmael and Isaac, I would lean more towards the fact that they loved each other and didn't have any type of animosity towards each other.
Yeah.
I would even say that they were in contact until the death.
Yeah, and so, I mean, it does seem that they lived very separate lives because, of course, Ishmael was set away. So they probably weren't very close. But yeah, we don't have a lot of negative information about Ishmael up to this point.
Right.
Things will eventually, of course, go downhill. But so we don't fully know. And you're right, we don't have a record of them saying, don't marry these women. But I do think it's probably, and again, if Esau was closer to Isaac, maybe Isaac wasn't emphasizing this as much. We don't really know because it says that it caused bitterness of Isaac and Rebekah. So, and we would imagine that he would know the story of Abraham sending the servant to go and bring Rebekah back to not marry the people from the people within the land. So I think it's reasonable to conclude that he would have had some instruction about, you're probably not supposed to marry these people.
If Isaac was so intent on Jacob marrying in the family, why wasn't he the same way toward Esau?
Well,
That was
yeah, and that's
after
part of
that.
what we don't know.
Well,
Sorry.
but didn't that occur after Esau had married?
Yeah, so the
So
account about
you've
Isaac
got-
is later. Is a little bit later in the story, after this all this birthright stuff. But
If you look at family dynamics, like I have 6 adult children, and I've watched a lot of families in my lifetime, and we don't as parents always pass the same thing on to each child. So depending on how intentional you are to impart God's ways or whatever, there's a lot of living that gets done where you have an intention at some point to pass on certain kinds of information, but in the living of life, you just sort of neglect it with some of the kids, and you're intentional with others. And so there's, you know, unless you're a totally intentional parent that every kid is gonna know this exact same information and we're gonna pass it on, in reality, it doesn't always happen that way. So sometimes I wonder how much is done in the spontaneity of the moment. So
Yeah.
that's what a lot of parenting is done, in the
Sure.
spontaneity of the moment.
sure, yeah. So I think there's a lot we don't know
Right.
about what was communicated. I think it's reasonable to conclude that something had been communicated to Esau about who he should marry. But Esau, again, what we're establishing is Esau's pretty impulsive. So he
Right.
may have, in the heat of a moment type of thing, again, this is some conjecture, but he may have in the heat of the moment been like, well, I don't really care, I want to marry this person. And if he's already given up his birthright, he might be like, why does it matter who I marry? So there could be lots of things at play, and there's a lot we don't really know. Do you have something?
Well, and knowing that the second was gonna get the blessing anyway, did they just not care as much with Esau? It's like, oh, okay, you're not getting it anyway, so I don't like this person, but fine, whatever.
Possible. However, we don't know if Isaac and Rebekah really fully know about this transaction that's taken place of selling the birthright.
Well, not even just.
We don't know if they don't, but we
Not
just don't know.
just selling it, I
Right.
mean, with her knowing that
Sure.
the younger.
Yeah.
I mean, not with the selling at
Yeah.
all, just be like, okay, well, we know that Isaac's gonna get it, sorry.
Mhm. Yeah, no,
He's gonna get it as accountable to the rules as the other, because it doesn't matter as much.
maybe. I do think they cared because it talks about their bitterness that they felt
Yeah,
when he did
I
this.
just, I don't mean not care,
Sure.
but give in.
Yeah. Maybe. So the point is here, there's a lot we don't know.
Yeah.
But it seems like Esau is, that they're so careful to point this out and point out the response of the parents. There seems to be, there's some tension at the very least about he didn't marry who he was supposed to marry. We don't know what he knew about that. We don't know how Isaac and Rebekah were interacting with this whole prophecy. But it seems like all is not well in the world with this interaction.
Good word.
Okay, so let's jump back to this. Let's jump back into now this chapter 27 about what actually happens with this blessing, which becomes very interesting. So 27 we have, Isaac is old and blind basically. So he calls Esau to him and says in verse 2, "Look, I'm old," he said, this is Isaac speaking, "I don't know the day of my death, so now please take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt me some game. Then prepare me a delicious meal that I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, so that my soul may bless you before I die." So what can we conclude about Isaac's intention in this?
Give the blessing to Esau.
He intends to bless Esau. So that could mean that he doesn't know about this whole sale of birthright issue. We don't know that, but his intention is clearly that he's going to bless Esau. Because it says that so that my soul may bless you before I die. So this is clear. He's intending to impart. He's intending to bestow probably physical and spiritual blessing on his son. Okay, but Rebekah is listening. And so then she goes to Jacob, and in verse 6 she says, "Look, I've heard your father speaking to your brother Esau, saying, 'Bring me some game and prepare me a delicious meal that I may eat and bless you in Adonai's presence.'" And she brings the Lord into it before my death. "So now, my son, listen to my voice, to what I am commanding you. Go now to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats from there, so that I may prepare them as a delicious meal for your father that he'll love. Then you'll bring it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before his death." But Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, "Look, my brother Esau is a hairy man, but I'm a smooth man. Perhaps my father will touch me, and he'll take for me a mocker, and I'll take me for a mocker, and I'll bring upon myself a curse and not a blessing." Okay, so pause. So is Jacob is arguing with her about what she's asking him to do? Is he?
Yeah, he's like, "You're not selling me on it."
No.
Well, but he says that go and do this so that you can go in and receive the blessing. But is he saying, no, I don't want to do that?
No, he's
No.
saying what are the
We need to
possible
think this
consequences?
through.
Yeah,
Right.
he's saying there's some problems with your plan.
Right.
He's not saying he's
Right.
unwilling to go.
That's true.
But he's afraid of
Right.
receiving a curse.
He is afraid of receiving a curse, but he's just
They're
seeing the obstacles along the
conspiring.
way.
Right.
So he's not saying no, I'm not going to do that. He's just saying, but what about this is going to be a problem in your plan.
How are we gonna deal
They're
with it?
conspiring.
Okay, so let's keep going. So then his mother said, "Let your curse fall on me, my son. Just listen to me and go and get them for me." So he went and got them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared a delicious meal that his father would love. Rebekah also took her elder son Esau's favorite clothes that were with her in the house, and she put them on her younger son Jacob, along with the skins of the young goats on his hands and the hairless parts on his neck. She put a delicious meal and the bread that she had prepared in the hand of Jacob her son. Okay. So Rebekah is saying she's going to take the curse. Okay?
Yeah, just-
And she puts Esau's clothes on him and covers him with hair, which I know we always are like, are you for real? You don't realize the difference between goat hair, but whatever. I realize this doesn't make a lot of sense to us, but nevertheless, this is what happens. Okay, so Rebekah is so determined, right, that she is like, we're going to overcome these obstacles and still do this. And Jacob is willing to go along with it. So we talked about earlier, we tend to put the stamp of deception on this story. So is there deception happening here?
Yes.
Yes. However, let's pause here for a second and think about the bigger picture again. And this goes to your question, Matt, about birthright and blessing. So are birthright and blessing the same?
Don't have to be.
Okay,
Similarities but nuances.
sure. Okay, I would agree. Are they connected?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say so, because could you see a problem where if one has this promise of the birthright or the right to a birthright and the other has the blessing? I think that might cause problems.
It should.
Yeah.
Isn't birthright associated with inheritance?
Mm-hmm.
And inheritance for the land goes back to the promise.
Mhm.
So if you split that up,
Yeah. So here's something that's interesting. So I would say that they're somewhat different, and we could argue about the exact nuances of how they're different. But I do think that they're connected, because I think the blessing is the means by which the birthright is kind of bestowed. I think the receiving and the birthright is kind of something that's like, eventually you're going to get this. The blessing is like, okay, now it's yours. That's the very simple way that I would explain that. Yeah.
Birthright is also material. It's,
Sure.
and blessing is more spiritual.
I think
Possibly.
both can be both.
Both can be both.
Because if we look at what's happening here, what Isaac is about to bestow, and we'll read the blessing here in just a second, is both physical, it's land and wealth and these kinds of things, but it's also this spiritual lineage, because of course we have this line, this bloodline being established, and it's going to place on Jacob, you are the one who continues this line. And this is why we call it the Abrahamic covenant, but it's really more accurate to call it the patriarchal covenant, because it's significant that it's the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and not the line of Abraham, Ishmael, and Esau. Those are very different things.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
and yes, I realize Esau is not Ishmael's son, but you get my point.
But he married his father.
What?
But he married his father.
True. So yes, in the lineage still. So I think that we have both spiritual and physical happening in both the birthright and the blessing here.
One doesn't miss, the birthright needs some form of blessing
Mhm.
to mean anything.
Sure.
A blessing does not need a birthright.
Mhm.
Oh, right.
Right, because Esau still gets a blessing as well, right?
Yeah.
And even when we look down, we look down the line to Jacob's sons, they all get blessings. But they, Richie's like, yeah, sort of. I mean, yes, but but there is this process of blessing, take for what you will, with all of them, but they're not all receiving the same birthright, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So do you, in my thought
That's good.
process on this, so Isaac is my understanding then that Isaac probably doesn't know that Esau sold his birthright,
Mhm.
and to the point where it says he despised his birthright, which I've also heard means that he didn't hold it in honor. I mean, there's lots of ways to interpret that word despise depending on the translation. But it makes me wonder, like, perhaps Isaac doesn't know,
He might.
that
I think that might be true.
that this interaction had gone on between his sons,
Mhm.
and that it really didn't seem to mean much
Mhm.
to Esau until, of course,
Until
he
it's
doesn't
time.
have it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And also the thing about this is, remember, they're twins. So,
Right.
so yes, Esau was born first, but like we know, Jacob came out, so a minute or two at most between when they're born. So I think there's some argument of like, who really is the firstborn? Yes, Esau was born first, but they were born at the same time. So, and this is an interesting thing, that this is Prager's comment about the Hebrews in verse 27:1. It says he called Esau his elder son, and in the Hebrew is different for older son versus firstborn, and it uses the Hebrew term for older son. It doesn't call him the firstborn,
Wait.
which is very interesting.
Say that again,
In-
please, in what verse?
In 27:1, it says Isaac calls Esau his elder son to him. So it's saying it calls his older son, but it doesn't call him the firstborn. So that doesn't mean, I still agree that Isaac probably didn't know about this, but the writer of this obviously clearly knows the story while writing, and is, so still pointing to the validity of the transaction that's already happened, of selling that birthright. So just an interesting little nuance there. So, but it does, again, we're saying, so at this point it does still seem that the intention is to bestow on Esau. So we do have this kind of intentional deception. It does seem that Rebecca is determined to see this through. So let me jump ahead a little bit to, and of course, I'm gonna skip over this a little bit because we're running short on time, because you guys have done such a good job of discussing. But Isaac questions quite a few times. He questions ultimately 4 different times. Are you really Esau? Like, he questions the voice, he questions the hair, he questions, he just questions how quickly he came. He's really, the smell, which is also, again, Rebecca's attention to detail that she put him in Esau's clothes. Yeah.
That's
Well,
good.
the question again, did they discuss this before this point, to where, did Isaac know, and yet
Right.
he was still choosing to give it to Esau, even though he knew, because Rebecca inquired of the Lord? So maybe Isaac didn't inquire of the Lord, and so maybe Rebecca inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord actually led her to do this, potentially.
But
Maybe.
he also favored Esau too.
Right,
It could also what?
because of food,
But he also favored
instead of
Esau.
Yeah.
for
he
moral
did.
reasons.
Mhm.
Right.
Right.
Is, if they had the discussion and Isaac does know, is he trying himself to work around it? Be like, oh, can't you just be Esau? I know you're not, but can't you just be?
Maybe. Yeah, again, there's a lot we don't know, so there's a lot of different ways there's a lot of different angles, which is part of what I was intending to point out, is there's a lot of unknowns, and so there's a lot of different ways that we can interpret what's going on. So let me look at this, let's look at what the blessing says a little bit. So I'm in chapter 27, verse 27. So he's finally convinced Isaac enough that that he is Esau, even though he's not. So there is certainly some deception here. However, that we move forward, and he says, so in the blessing, he says, behold, the smell of my son is like the smell of the field that Adonai has blessed. May God give you from the dew of the sky and from the fatness of the land an abundance of grain and new wine. May people serve you, and may nations bow down to you. Be master over your brothers. May your mother's sons bow down to you, and may those who curse you be cursed, and may those who bless you be blessed. So, we have both, in this blessing, we have both, of course, those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. This is this continuation of the Abrahamic covenant, correct? This is the language, we're very used to seeing that language. But interestingly, right before that, be master over your brothers, may your mother's sons bow down to you, which is precisely what the Lord said to Rebekah when she inquired of the Lord.
2 nations.
2 nations, and that the older would serve the younger and would bow down. So, even though he thinks this is Esau, he's giving this blessing that fits both of these previous words of the Lord. So, yeah.
Is it possible that this didn't fool him at all, and he just decided to go along with it?
That's a good
Possible.
question,
know.
probably.
Because it does seem, like we said, we have all these questioning. So did he really believe that this was Esau, or did he know it was Jacob and he knew that it was, he needed to kind of, if we operate under the assumption that he knew what the prophecy was.
Then he wasn't a complete idiot.
Right, and that he finally was like, okay,
Yeah.
I need to bless this son. Possible, yeah.
I think I would have to be okay with his response to Esau's reaction, that he wept bitterly, greatly, exceedingly when he found out what happened.
Yeah.
So if he didn't know, that would make him a tremendous Academy Award winner.
That's true.
And
That's
then I
a
would
very
have
good
to
point.
change my understanding of Isaac.
Sure.
Not that
So
big
yeah,
of
so I think it probably, that's a really good point. So I think it probably is more likely, he may have had some question, but it does seem that he was convinced. And then probably, but I mean, I think there may be an element to hit when Esau comes in and his response is this, oh my goodness, what have I just done?
That's true.
That he was like, oh, I was right, I should have trusted my intuition. But he's already bestowed this blessing.
There's also this possibility, since we're talking about possibilities, that Isaac may have been wanting Jacob to admit, if he really thought it might be Jacob, that he was fishing for Jacob to admit what he was doing. I mean, we don't know, but that could be another side of why if he knew, why he may have just been fishing. How many times do we fish for our children to respond and admit what they've done?
Yeah, and so again, this is a complicated situation.
Of course,
We have several people who are kind of in sort of no-win situations, but I think Jacob is really one of them. I think and this is part of what, I'm not saying that Jacob is innocent at all, because he did say, yes, I'm Esau. He is clearly lying. But he's kind of in a sticky spot, because it's either he goes against his mother. I mean, his mother is kind of driving this deception. But either he goes against her and allows Esau to receive the blessing, which doesn't belong to him, which, like we've already talked about, creates a lot of problems if we have this separation of birthright and blessing. Or he goes along with it and is willing to take part in this deception for this right order. Because, again, going back to, there's a lot of I don't knows in this, but but either Isaac knows and is disregarding it, or Rebekah failed to work with her husband on this, which is also a problem, or
So, probably.
excuse me. You know, there's all these problems. There's clearly some communication breakdowns. We also have Esau's character to deal with versus Jacob's character, neither of which is perfect. However, Esau does seem to be more impulsive, whereas Jacob does seem to at least have some kind of care and intention toward the God and the family and this lineage that's going on. The direction of his parents. So yeah, so Jacob is moving in the same direction that as his parents. Esau apparently is a little bit more prone to, you know, the whims of his flesh. And so you know, like it's a complicated issue. And so we can sit here all day long and question, did they do the right thing? And we don't fully know. But the point is, I'm not saying that there was no deception in this. I'm just saying that I think that the intention of Rebekah and Jacob seems to be to do their part to push along the will of the Lord. So their intention is to participate in the promise that's been given. Did they do it absolutely correctly? Probably not. However, I think, and this is a point that Dennis Prager brings out, that I think we have to hold in tension with this, is that it does seem to, I mean, there are times when people try to act on God's behalf and they do it wrong and there's punishment involved. So again, there's tension in this. But it does seem that God wants people to partner with him. He requires action of people.
Right.
He requires people to be moving in his direction. Clearly, none of us can do it perfectly.
Great.
I don't know that I think that, you know, if God had given the bullet pointed list, that he would have necessarily said, yeah, go pretend to be your brother. But he allows it, and he allows the blessing, and he allows us to keep going. Obviously, we're going to continue to have complicated family dynamics. I mean, Rebekah is seeking the best for her son, and she's seeking the will of the Lord. However, you know, what happens ultimately is that she has to send Jacob away because Esau's mad. He's out to kill his brother. And Rebekah's like, it's all going to be for nothing if Esau goes and kills Jacob. So she has to send him away. And so she's still losing both of her sons in some sense. You know, because she has to send him away. And we don't know that they ever see each other again.
Right.
And that would have been heartbreaking for her.
Right.
So it doesn't all end in sunshine and roses. But I'm also, my goal is to point out all the tensions and not to give you a nice, happy little ending, because that's not how it works.
Well, here's another tension for me is we don't know how God would have done this differently other than the story that's being told, you know, in an official, righteous way to do it. And so is Adonai intimately involved in this entire process, and somehow he's not contradicting himself through being intimately involved in broken human beings looking to deceive one another, and yet this is what he said was going to happen at the beginning, and how that would have played out differently than what we read here.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, I think we have this, you know, through all the Torah, especially in Genesis, we have this progressive revelation situation. So they're still very much learning what it's like for God to be involved in their life.
Yeah.
And so they don't necessarily know exactly how to partner with the Lord in every little situation.
Would it kind of be her punishment for the deception? You lose your kids because you went about it the wrong way. Sorry.
Yeah, I think I would use the word consequence more so than punishment, just because I think it's a little bit.
Well, losing your kids is a punishment.
It's a little bit of a nicer.
But it's a punishment to lose your kids.
It is, but there still is. I mean, I think that there's still love between mother and son.
Yeah.
I don't think it. You know, and she's doing what's best by sending him away. And so I don't know that it's. You know, it's ultimately what needs to happen. And she's actually intending for it to just be for a few days. She thinks, you know, she's going to send him away for a few days. Esau's going to cool off, and Jacob's going to come back. So it wasn't really her intention. And so we don't. Again, it's another. We don't know. I don't know that I think the Lord is punishing her for what's happening here. I think that what plays out is, again, the messy tension of they're trying to follow the Lord. Did they do it perfectly? Probably not, but do any of us?
Nope.
Right.
So it's again pointing back to the very real example. And ultimately, yes, they, the end of this portion ends with this instruction about who he's supposed to marry. And Esau then is kind of trying, we kind of talked about already, kind of trying to make it right by, taking another wife who's not from the Canaanites, who's from Ishmael's line instead. So he's kind of trying to work his way back in because he's really feeling the gravity of what he's done. At first when he sells his birthright, he's like, who freaking cares? And now he's realizing that there's like an eternal implication, and he's kind of recognizing that too.
When it says Esau realized as he's watching his father bestow this blessing, and Jacob listens and goes, there's a word in the interlinear that is not translated in the English, and I talked with Nassim about this. The word is padena, and tell them what padena means.
Padena means to reward you back and help you and save you and give you back something you did or you asked for.
So it's saying that Esau, at the end of that verse, it says padena, that Esau understood the revelation of the generational going onward, that's what was aware to him.
Wake up.
Yeah.
Yeah, he kind of, so it's this shift of perspective, right? Because we were talking about it seems they had quite different perspectives, that Esau was very focused on right now, and Jacob had kind of the foresight. So it seems like, it's this wake-up call, like you're saying, to realize, my decisions have consequences and implications much further than right now, than me being hungry right now. And so, so that's significant. And he still is, in the blessing to Esau, he is still, he still receives some level of blessing. However, it's at, it's at a different level, and it's at being kind of under his brother versus being, this firstborn situation. So we need to end because it's like 8 minutes till service starts, but go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking of what, Elena, nice to see you. She brought up the idea of consequences and punishment, and I think that's something that gets obscured a lot. Consequences are different than punishment. You can have punishment that's connected to a consequence. But I think we need to not confuse the two, because consequences are just, this is the result of what the action was. Whereas punishment implies we've sinned, there's been a violation somewhere. So they can be connected, but they're not necessarily the same thing.
Consequences are self-inflicted.
Yeah, because you're choosing.
Yeah, it's a result of your choice.
Result of your choice, or sometimes the consequence is the result of someone else's choice made.
Yeah. So in this case, the consequence is really, Esau has been making poor choices, and he's realizing that, and he's angry. The ultimate result is that he's angry. So the consequence is Jacob needs to leave and get out of the path of his anger. Ultimately, that becomes a consequence for Rebecca because her son is, she has kind of this difficulty with her son, but I don't know that I see that those are necessarily punishments.
Sometimes it can seem that way.
Yeah. I think it grieved her for sure, and she might have felt that way. And I wonder if we don't know. Again, more things we don't know. She might have, really wrestled with, did I do the right thing, or did I really, do I do what God wanted me to do? We don't know what level how she processed through this whole situation and how she felt about it after it was all said and done. She, because she had to live with her part that she played in having Jacob kind of deceive Isaac. And so, it's kind of this story of like, there's a lot of weight to this situation for all parties, and they all had to kind of live with the decisions that they made along the way, but ultimately the blessing landed on the right person. So does the end justify the means? I don't know, but it does actually seem like, the way I kind of see it is, it does seem like the intention was for the blessing to land on the right person, as God had said. And they kind of took it upon themselves to what, if that was too much or whatever, we don't really know. But that seems to be the intention, because Isaac was clearly determined to still bestow the blessing on Esau, and that we know that couldn't happen. And so it's complicated. So it is 9:55, so we need to end. So I'm going to pray, and we will conclude. Thank you for participating in the discussion today. Hopefully it was, I know we didn't come to a lot of really profound conclusions, and we didn't tie anything up in a nice little bow, but hopefully it was helpful to look at some of these nuances in the story. All right. So Lord, we again are here on Shabbat, and we thank you for Shabbat. We thank you for this day of rest, this day of just getting to feel you press closer to us, Lord. We just ask for your presence in service, Lord. We ask for your presence throughout the day, throughout the week, Lord. We thank you for the opportunity to gather together and for the opportunity to study your word, Lord. And I just ask that you would just bless each person who is here, who's watching the live stream, both here in this room and in service, Lord. And I just ask that you would just continue to reveal your heart to us and help us to learn how to become more like you. B'Shem Yeshua.
Amen.
Thanks, Emma.